Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, better. Sorry about that. I had my settings wrong. I think I'm ready to start if you are.
Ready.
Okay.
Want me to make the announcement now?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay. Buenas noches y bienvenidos a la presentación del reporte anual de IOLERO para año 23-24. Si ocupan interpretación, hay un mundo abajo en las opciones que si le hacen clic y escogen su lenguaje, pueden escuchar traducción a español. ¿Ok? Gracias.
Okay, so my name's John Alden, and I'm the director of IOLERO. We're doing our annual report town hall tonight, which is kind of free form. So there'll be an opportunity for people to chime in about what they want to talk about, and also there'll be opportunities to ask questions, and we can change the direction of the conversation tonight depending on what the audience is interested in. This is not a meeting of the CAC, our Community Advisory Council, so it doesn't have the structure of a Brown Act meeting where we have to be very careful about giving everybody exactly the same amount of time and being cautious about Q&A. This is designed to be just a chat with IOLERO staff so that you can get to know some of the material in our annual report a little bit better. One of the things that you probably noticed at the beginning is that we have all this in English and Spanish. So unless I get word that no one has signed up for Spanish translation, I'll be speaking a little bit slowly so that the interpreters have time to chime in. We do have, I think, at least one or two members of the CAC, our Community Advisory Council, on the call tonight. But again, it's not one of their meetings, and they're here to listen just like everybody else is here to listen. So as opportunities present, feel free to chime in and ask some questions. I'll ask for people to raise their hands like on any other Zoom you've been on, and we'll go through the audience questions as they come. One of the things we'll do tonight is use a short Kahoot, a poll, to figure out where people want to start with the conversation tonight. Before I get to that, though, so far, did we have any takers on the Spanish language translation yet? Doesn't look like it from my end, but sure.
Hi, John. I don't see anyone on my end.
Okay. I'll talk a little bit faster than I would otherwise. And Ricardo, please do let me know if that changes so I can slow down to facilitate the translation. Okay. I am going to share a screen here for a moment and show you the Kahoot that I mentioned. Okay, so what you see here is a quiz that you're about to be given, or a poll that you're about to be given. It's got 6 options for topics. We can cover all 6 of these tonight. We can cover other options also. But I was curious to find out from our audience which of these topics that are covered in our annual report are particularly of interest. So in a minute, we're going to open up a Kahoot panel where you'll have the opportunity to enter a code in the Kahoot app and then vote for which of these 6 items you want to start with. I'm going to show you a link for downloading the Kahoot app in a couple of minutes. But just so you know, these are going to be the 6 options you'll have. And again, we could cover others, but based on the response I've gotten so far, these seem to be the 6 I'm asked about the most. One is PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and how that applies in Sonoma County. Another are changes to the canine policy, the use of police dogs to bite. Completeness and agreement, meaning how much IOLERO and the Sheriff's Office agree or disagree about how our cases go. Free speech issues, so that's how the Sheriff's Office decides whether they can or should discipline employees inside the Sheriff's Office for the things they say in public. Jail staffing changes, meaning how the jail caught up on its short staffing from last year, and how we take a look at medical care in jail. Okay, so again, these are not the only possible 6 things we can talk about tonight, but these 6 have been the subject of a lot of questions I've received so far. So I'm guessing that at least some of these 6 are going to be high priority. So I'm going to launch this Kahoot poll in a minute here. And you're going to see a screen that's going to give you instructions about how to download the app, the Kahoot app, if you don't have it already, and then how to participate in the poll real quick. We'll give people a few minutes to do that and see what answers we get. Okay, so for those of you who are watching, right here, Kahoot.it is where you can get on this particular Kahoot, or you can download the Kahoot app if you don't have it already. This pin 6594941 is what you enter into Kahoot to make sure you're in this particular poll. And then the QR code you see there is another way to get in. So you've got at least 3 different ways to get in. We'll give people a minute here to sign up if they're interested. And hopefully at least some of you are. Give people just another minute or so to join in if they want to participate in Kahoot. Looks like we just have a few people interested, but anyone who's on the Zoom is welcome to join. Last chance to hop in on the Kahoot here. Looks like we only have a few people that want to have some input, so we'll have them start. Here we go with the Kahoot. Okay, here are your 6 options. Go ahead and pick which one you'd like to start with. The countdown on the far left is the timer to add your choices. And if you haven't already gotten into the poll, it's not too late to join the Kahoot and vote. Okay, it looks like canine policy changes were the most popular, followed by free speech issues. Okay. That is helpful. Thanks for participating. Okay, so given that input, let's start off with talking about canine policy. So I want to start first by making sure I'm giving you a clear foundation about what we've been working on with respect to the use of canines in Sonoma County and what we have not. So for those of you who saw our work last year in our annual report, you'll remember that we audited 3 different cases that all involved the use of a canine or a police dog to bite somebody by the sheriff's office. So we have not done any auditing work or policy work about the use of canines to do things other than bite people. So canines can and are used to search for narcotics, to do search and rescue work, like to search for people in the rubble of a building when there's an earthquake or some other disaster. Sometimes they're used to find people, either because they're missing or they're being sought after, like, say, someone in the woods. And they often, you'll see, show up in at community events, not so much to do work, but sort of as an ambassador. Right? So there are a variety of ways in which police dogs are used, but the only one that we've been looking at closely here in Sonoma County, pardon me, has to do with how they're used to bite. When a canine or police dog is used to bite people by police officers or sheriff's deputies, the Fourth Amendment controls how that's done. So the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution is the first and primary we use in assessing whether a police dog is allowed to bite someone or is not allowed to bite someone. Or to put it more accurately, how it is that the person who's handling that police dog, the deputy sheriff or police officer, can and cannot use that dog to bite other people. And typically what we see under the Fourth Amendment is that any use of force like that has to be reasonable under the circumstances. Because police dogs are a higher level of force, a more dramatic intrusion on the body, have the risk of creating greater injury than some other kinds of force, they tend to be subjected to greater scrutiny than some other kinds of force. This is what we might call an intermediate level of force under the Fourth Amendment, meaning there are more rules in the Fourth Amendment about how that kind of force is used than there are for, say, a deputy striking someone with their fist or hitting them with a baton. But it's a more permissive standard than is the case for shooting someone or using other fatal force. In this regard, what we call this intermediate level of force is the same level of force that's used, the level of force test that's used for tasers. Like the electrical current that courses through someone's body when a taser is used, the dog's bite has the potential to cause, greater potential to cause injury at least, than usually a strike with a hand or a fist or an elbow or a knee, or just tripping someone or forcing them to the ground. So for these intermediate levels of force, like having a canine bite someone or using a taser, we use a standard that includes the requirement that there be some immediate threat to public safety, the immediate threat of injury to some other person. That doesn't always have to be the case if someone is, say, taken to the ground or struck with a fist. If someone is going to be shot at by police, we have a higher standard. There has to be a risk that they're actually going to seriously injure or kill someone else if the firearm is going to be used. So this immediate risk of serious injury to others is the middle standard that we use for tasers and canines. Now, there's a lot to unpack here about how canines are used, but that standard is really important to understand. So I want to give a moment here to see if there are questions about that very short summary of a very complicated standard. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. Are there people who want to ask about what that standard means or how it works before I go any deeper? Okay, I don't see any hands. So let's dig a little more on that. So one of the things that we recommended in our annual report last year was that the canine policy here in Sonoma County be revised to make it clear that that standard I just described applies to canine bites, just as it does to deploying a taser. Now, in this regard, canines tend to be used in a couple of different specific circumstances where that level of force might be justified. One might be if there's a person who we have reasonable suspicion is actually going to pose that kind of danger to others, like, say, an armed felon who's hiding in a warehouse, but can't be seen or found. And so a police officer or a sheriff's deputy might send the dog to go find that person and bite them until they come out. And the courts have allowed that on the theory that in a case where that person really presents that high of a level of danger, it's better to have the dog taking the risk than a person taking the risk to go find that suspect in that hidden location where they might be able to surprise or injure a police officer. And again, only if there's some reason to think that person's already armed and dangerous. So in that environment, we sometimes see police dogs being used. We also see them being used where people are presenting an active, threat or danger to people in the moment that we can actually perceive. So they're not hidden, but they're visible, right? And either case, we're looking for some kind of immediate threat of serious injury to others. One thing that the sheriff's office did in this past year, partly in response to our report, but also in part because of a report that the sheriff's office got from an independent expert, was they did a better job of tying together in their canine policy this use of force standard with the use of the canine. So it's a little clearer to deputies who might be thinking about using a canine that one has to be able to show this immediate threat. And so that immediacy requirement has been made clearer in the policy from the sheriff's office. We think that's a tremendous improvement over previous policy. And one of the reasons we think that that's an improvement is, for the reason I just described, right? But another reason we think it's been an improvement is that since that time, we haven't seen any other bites causing serious injury at all. Now, I want to put out a caveat here. Just because we haven't seen use of force occur in the last year or so doesn't guarantee that it's never going to happen in the future, but at least it's progress in the right direction, right? If we had seen the opposite, continued bites that we thought were out of policy, like we saw last year, that might be a warning sign that either the policy or the training the sheriff's office had implemented wasn't sufficient. In this case, we actually saw the opposite. We saw no other bites that we're aware of or that have been reported to us at IOLERO. And so that at least suggests that there were no problematic or out of policy bites over the last year. So we're really happy to see that. In addition to that improvement in policy, I want to give some positive feedback to the sheriff's office for making sure that we've been included at IOLERO at some opportunities to see the current canine training, how it works and what they do. And also members of our community advisory council have been invited to some of those trainings and had opportunity to see what it is that the dogs are trained to do and how they're trained to do it. And so that increased transparency gives us also greater confidence that the current training and policy are in step with current law. And that gives us good reason to think that we'll probably see in the future a lower rate, or hopefully no, incidents of problematic bites that we think are not compliant with policy or law. I would also point out that this is one reason why the work that we do at IOLERO has the potential to create savings for the county. There's no question that we've paid out a fair amount of money as a county on some of the bites that we audited last year. There were those three in particular were all the subject, well, pardon me, two of the three were the subject of significant civil suits where the county had to pay out a substantial amount of money. The county does carry insurance for that purpose, which is good. But as you can imagine with any other insurance product, the more one pays out over time, the more one's rates tend to go up. So even if an insurer is paying those settlements and not the county directly, it still makes sense for us as a county to try to make sure those don't happen if they can be avoided. So in that regard, we think there's a strong, fiscal reason why it's a good thing that IOLERO took some time to audit those cases, and also good that the sheriff's office revised and improved their policy. Questions so far about anything that brought up canines? For those of you who are interested in learning more about canines, did that answer your questions, or do you have some other things that you would like to hear about? This is your chance to raise your hand if you voted for this topic and want to dig into it some more. No? Okay. I'm not seeing any of their hands, so we will move on to some other topics. The second topic that got flagged in our Kahoot poll was talking about how the First Amendment applies in the context of public employment. This gets complicated and detailed really fast, but I think a fair short summary is that in the world of public employment, everybody who works for government still has a First Amendment right to speak up about how government is doing, just like any private person does. So for somebody like me or Lizette, who's on this call, or a teacher or a firefighter or a janitor or an attorney working for the government, all of those people still have the opportunity and the right to speak up about what they see going on in government. And so I think an easy example there would be, just because someone's a government employee does not mean that they're prohibited from getting on Facebook and saying who they want to vote for president, or working with friends to go, door to door gathering signatures for a ballot measure, or showing up at public events like a rally, for example, for one or another candidate that they like. These activities are all still protected for public employees, just like they are for everybody else. So, any rate, that means that for all of us who work in government, there's the same protection for our speech as there is for everybody else. On the other hand, one of the things that the folks in our courts have figured out is that there is sometimes a challenge where a public employee is saying something about their own agency, the one that they're working for, that is really detrimental to the mission of the agency, right? So, for example, if someone was working for a public agency, wanted to say to the media, hey, my boss is a liar and a crook, and they had no good reason to say that, and they're in the media all the time saying that about the boss at work, it might make their agency kind of struggle to function, right? If they falsely accuse people inside their own agency of theft, right, and they're very public about it, that might be problematic. Likewise, if they said out in public, hey, I know that the rules about my agency are such that I'm supposed to treat everybody equally, that I run into in my work, but I don't believe in that. I think there's a certain set of people that I'm justified in treating really poorly because I don't like them. I don't like their nationality, or I don't like their religion, or I don't like their class, or the like. That would be really problematic for the agency too, because it would diminish the public's trust in the work that they do. So these issues are, they're rare, but when they come up and this conflict evolves between someone saying something fairly extreme in the public, pardon me, and this right of public employees to speak up about their beliefs about how they think government should be run, the courts impose a balancing test. And this balancing test is kind of complicated, and honestly, in some ways, it's a little hard to understand because some courts seem to describe it differently. But one of the things that is important in this balancing test of figuring out whether the employee's speech has crossed the line is whether it impairs the ability of the agency to function. And so that usually comes up when somebody has said something about how they do their job that indicates that they're not going to follow the law or they're not going to treat people fairly when they're doing that same job inside their agency. There are some other ways it can pop up. Somebody doing something that's so far outside community standards that it creates challenges for the reputation of the agency can be a problem too. That's a fairly vague standard, but it is one we see sometimes. So that usually comes up when someone has, say, committed a crime that's kind of the opposite of the work that they do. So, an example, tragic, but an example you see sometimes in case law would be someone who is a teacher in a school, but then is convicted of selling or dealing drugs or engaging in child pornography. So totally incompatible with the work of being a teacher. That if they did it off duty, we wouldn't want them to be a teacher anymore, right? And that kind of behavior is really extreme and goes beyond First Amendment most of the time. But those are the kinds of things that the courts allow public employers like the County of Sonoma to separate employees or fire employees for. So how do you figure out if the conduct of the employee has negatively affected somebody in that agency, has negatively affected the agency's ability to provide public service? Well, one of the things the courts have said about that is you don't have to actually get to the point where you can prove that the impairment to the public has actually happened. We don't have to show that people in the public, say with a poll, have lost faith in the agency. We don't have to show a particular operation that's actually not going well anymore, like people withdrawing from the school and school examples I gave, right? It can be as easy as saying, look, this kind of conduct would cause a reasonable person to no longer have faith in or trust our agency if this kind of conduct were known. An example would be, and this is the one you see in law enforcement the most, is where somebody who works in law enforcement says in a public forum that they have committed a crime or that they choose to discriminate against people when they're enforcing the law. Those are extreme kinds of statements to make. But in those kinds of situations, the courts will support a public agency like a sheriff's office or a police department in firing those kinds of law enforcement officials. Even if there isn't any specific evidence that the agency's function or mission has been impaired yet, because we think it's just so highly likely that it will, that the courts say you should go ahead and fire people like that. The second reason that the courts have this standard that the injury to the mission of the agency needs to only be potential or likely as opposed to proven is because it's very hard to figure out how exactly you prove that. Do you have to show that the agency's reputation diminished by a certain percentage point in a public poll? Do you have to show a certain number of negative letters to the editor in the local paper? Do you have to show a certain number of complaints coming in? Does it matter who complained or how upset they were? These kinds of measures are very difficult, and, as you can imagine, slippery to try to impose. So the courts have not asked for that kind of certainty to be used in this environment. It's hard to gauge public trust. It's hard to gauge public sentiment. So that's another reason the courts have said it's important we have this rule, that it's the potential for damage to the agency's ability to do its job, to its reputation with the public, to be sufficient for discipline. So one of the things we've recommended to the sheriff's office in Sonoma County is that they actually use that standard because we think it would be very hard to try to prove what the injury is in any given case like that. And also because that way they don't have to start picking and choosing on who in the public has lost faith in the agency when somebody has done something fairly extreme in the public eye. What we've found is the sheriff's office has actually been using a slightly different standard, which is they've been saying to us, at least in the cases they've investigated, that they actually want to see some injury to the public before they're willing to discipline sheriff's department employees for things they might do in the public eye. And we think that's a risky standard to use, and it is a more lenient standard than the one imposed by law. And so we think that's not a good idea on a policy level. I know that's very esoteric and kind of complicated, but there was an ask to talk about that a little bit, so I'm going to dig into it a little bit more. I'm wondering if there are some questions about that issue. I see you've had some questions about other things, but is there a question about that issue? Welcome to raise your hand or use the Q&A, whatever you feel is easier.
John, there is a question from Donna.
That's about a different topic, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to get to that until later, but thank you for flagging. Nothing? Okay, all right. Alcina, looks like you raised your hand. Let me let you in there. Okay.
There we go. Hi.
All right.
I'm just curious about how regular civilians can kind of pressure that issue of not discipline, but or disciplining deputies that speak in ways that we think are outrageous, which has happened in the last few years. And is that something that we need to write to them about, or do we kind of send IOLERO a note saying that we want that to be a focus? Do we let CAC know that we want that to be a focus? How do we proceed? And that's all.
Well, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. I would say there are a couple things you can do in that regard. One is if there's a specific instance where there's some public employee conduct out in the public sphere, could be on Facebook or YouTube or in a newspaper or the like, the best thing that you can do is send in a complaint. And if you send your complaint to IOLERO, then we will audit how that case was investigated and what conclusion the sheriff reached. And then that case will show up in an anonymized way in our annual report. And there's one case like that in the current annual report that talks about this issue. And so that way people can take a look at that one and give the sheriff's office some feedback about whether they think the sheriff's office did the right thing in that particular case. So I'd say that's your first and foremost, the best way to take some action about it. Another is that, as with anything in our annual report, any member of the public can get in touch with the sheriff's office and say, hey, I read this part of the annual report from IOLERO, and we thought that, this issue was one where the sheriff's office should take up IOLERO's recommendation. In this one, in our annual report, which you can download from our website if you haven't already, this free speech issue is described at page 58. And we have a generalized description there about these issues that I just discussed and hit in our conversation. And then if you look in the case summaries, you can see more about this issue starting at page 129. And that goes through a series of different kinds of cases, some of which are about other issues, but basically have to do with discrediting the department or making the department, look bad in one way or another as a result of conduct that happened in the public or that became available to the public. So, we'd suggest taking a look at that, writing or calling the sheriff's office and letting them know what you think about it. And when you see behavior like that in the future that you're concerned about, sending in a complaint to IOLERO. Anybody else want to raise their hand? Yeah. Okay. I know that's a lot of material, and there's quite a bit in the report about that, so it might merit a fair bit of reading. I'd like to talk a fair bit tonight about how things are going at the jail, and I welcome questions either through the Q&A or people raising their hand to talk about it. We have a whole series of issues that pardon me, we talked about in the jail. And if you're looking at our annual report, you can find these at pages 63 through 74. And that's where we talk about all the different policy issues that are going on in the jail. And then we have a set of cases that we audited that related to the jail. And those are at page 143 through 204. So like 60 pages almost.
Oh my God.
Material at the jail. It's quite a lot of stuff, right? So more than we could possibly talk about even tonight, right? But I would like to flag there a few issues and see if there are particular ones that are standing out to this group as ones we should cover tonight. Amongst the issues that we talked about with respect to the jail are strip searches in the jail, telephone access and signage, how the Prison Rape Elimination Act applies in the jail. I'd particularly like to cover that one in a little bit of depth because I think it's important. Body-worn camera activations in the jail, preservation of jail video, how the jail has responded to the challenge of staffing levels, and generally speaking, medical care in the jail. And I'm wondering if either through raising hands or Q&A, if there's a particular place there where people would like me to start, because that could be the rest of our evening, depending on what everybody wants to talk about. And if I don't see a suggestion, I will dig into some of the things that I think are the most essential. And remember, it's a town hall, so you all get to speak out if you want to. No? Okay. Oh, wait, I do see a hand up. Someone labeled Zoom user, so I'm sorry, I can't introduce you because I don't know your name, but hit allow to talk and you can tell us what you'd like to ask about.
Oh, hi guys, it's Barbara. I don't know why I'm labeled as Zoom user. Yeah, on the whole question around the jails, it's like a statewide, it's actually a countrywide problem, right? That treatment in jails continues to be a problem. There's a lot higher incidence of abuse of prisoners, and also the mental health piece, because for most counties, and we're no exception, the jail is the #1 treatment place, or the #1 location for people with mental health challenges. And I know that that's been an ongoing problem, not just in Sonoma County, but statewide, countrywide. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, as you talk to other professionals that are looking at this, what are you seeing as the ways that law enforcement is trying to address it? Because it just seems like it's an ongoing issue. They've had issues with the vendor that they use to, quote, provide the mental health services. And of course, some of this was exacerbated by the understaffing as well, both the mental health impacts to those people that were in jail, and also just the treatment by the correctional officers as well. So I'm just like, in a bigger picture, like, it just seems like this is an ongoing problem that we always see, and I'm just not sure what is the current thought about what we should be doing to make it, to improve it.
Oh, that's a great question. I think you know, that policy issue is a really difficult one, and I'm glad you bring it up because it's not like we have an answer for that inside of our annual report, for sure. We do flag some issues that are closely related that you might find useful. I mean, we do talk in there about how medical care is provided in the jail, and you know how we do that in Sonoma County. So let me suggest a couple things, and then Barbara, either you or someone else can, you know, follow up with me with some questions. First off, I think it's important to think about medical care and mental health care separately. They have a lot in common, but they tend to be provided by different sets of providers with different expertise. And so I think that's one reason why it's useful for us to think about them separately. And medical care tends to be, at least in jails, as opposed to prisons, where people tend to be incarcerated for longer periods of time. A lot of the questions that come up in medical care in jail tend to be about more acute, short-term conditions, as opposed to managing very, very long-term conditions, like say over a decade, like diabetes or cancer, right? So what we tend to see more often in our jail are the more urgent medical situations, or a relatively short period of time where someone needs to have some longer term care maintained, like they still need access to a medication they're on a regular basis. So we have a system in our jail for making sure people can ask for treatment and then get that treatment if they need it. The mental health care is more complicated because usually that requires really long-term treatment plans. You know, like a broken wrist, for example, will take a while to heal, but it can be treated in the course of a day, and then monitored over time, right? Mental health care typically requires years of treatment. So a struggle that the Sonoma County Jail has had, but every jail has had in California, is that tremendously high numbers of people who have mental health challenges are often getting booked into jail and end up staying there for some time because they also have criminal charges against them that usually are in some way related to or rooted in the mental health crisis that already we're having. And honestly, we don't have a good solution for that at the state level. one of the things we've been trying to do here in Sonoma County is create a behavioral housing unit, or BHU, for the purpose of housing people who have mental health care challenges, right? So moving people over into that system in a separate building with separate treatment professionals, specialized for people with mental health challenges, so that folks there could receive the kind of treatment that you're just describing. That is not something we've been able to fund yet. And I think part of the reason that we haven't been able to fund that yet is that money we've gotten from the state for that purpose, we've put into, you might call it a savings account, where we've saved up, but the cost of construction keeps outpacing the expenses. And so this is not an uncommon problem. It's one that we're having throughout the state. And it ultimately, unfortunately, comes down to money, being able to build the facilities that we need at the local level to provide mental health care treatment really is expensive. And as I mentioned, requires longer term care. And so providing that mental health care is kind of complicated because we just don't seem to have the money to do it here in Sonoma County, or really in any county. I don't know any county right now that's doing any better of a job than we are here in Sonoma County. And it's almost entirely because between the state and the federal government, we just don't have the funding for it. It's not a real encouraging answer. But Barbara, that I think tells us a little bit about where mental health care is. Then I could tell you a little bit more about traditional medical care if you're ready. Do you have another question though about mental health care before I move on?
I'm good. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, that's a downer of an answer. I will give a lot of credit though to our board of supervisors for trying. You know, they did secure some funding, and they keep coming back to that issue on a regular basis, and hopefully they will be able to actually build a behavioral health unit. As for the kind of care that people are given on a day-to-day basis for, say, an injury or some other kind of illness, that medical care is provided by a contract group called WellPath. WellPath provides medical health care to people in a wide variety of prisons and jails throughout the country. As far as I know, it's probably the largest such contract provider. And so our county, like a lot of counties, has an ongoing contract with them to provide the services in the jail. They pay the personnel in the jail, like doctors and nurses who provide the health care. And that means that they're making treatment decisions. Those doctors and nurses employed by WellPath are making treatment decisions for people who are in the jail. In this regard, federal law has two different standards for how much or what quality of healthcare people are supposed to get in the jail. This gets very complicated, but this is a little disturbing, but there's a slightly lower standard for people depending on whether they are in a prison for a long period of time and have lost their freedom, or if they are in a jail temporarily because they're being held before they've actually been convicted of a crime. Different constitutional amendments apply to those two. The 8th Amendment bar on cruel and unusual punishment applies to people in prisons. And therefore, to some of the people in our jail who are in prison there for a period of time because they've already been convicted of a crime. And the 4th Amendment applies to all the people who haven't been convicted of a crime yet. To their credit, WellPath and our jail both use the more robust standard of healthcare for everybody in the jail regardless. So while legally the jail could create a two-tiered system, they don't. They provide everybody the same higher level of healthcare. And I appreciate that. That's a positive there. As for WellPath, there are two aspects from my perspective as an auditor about how we can assess the quality of the care that people are getting through WellPath. The first is, to what extent does the jail actually allow people who are incarcerated in the jail access to WellPath for care when they need it? And as a general rule, people are getting access to WellPath and their care when they ask. So unlike some other facilities where that's a problem, to the extent we've ever had an accusation that we've had a chance to take a look at in the Sonoma County Jail about people claiming they were denied access to healthcare, we haven't found any of those sustainable. So in the specific instances that we're looking at, when a deputy hears that somebody has a condition and wants, like an injury or just an illness, and they want some treatment from WellPath, they're getting connected to WellPath promptly. And then those treatment providers are making decisions and providing instructions back to jail staff about how to monitor that person. And those instructions are being followed as far as we can tell. So at least from all the cases we have seen, that first step, getting jail staff to honor people's access to the medical professionals, is going very well. We don't have any reason to think that it isn't. If people have complaints about that in any specific instance, we'll take that complaint and make sure it gets investigated by the sheriff's office, and then we'll audit that complaint. So I certainly do want people to feel that if they need more transparency about that part of the process, they can come to us and get their complaint investigated. That said, we don't have a way to assess the second step, which is whether WellPath's doctors and nurses are making sound treatment decisions for the incarcerated folks in jail. That's beyond our subject matter expertise. We don't have anyone at IOLERO who has enough medical background to assess whether the right medicine was prescribed, or whether a wrist strap, a splint, or a cast was the best solution to the complaint a person had about their wrist, or about whether the right tests were administered when someone had a certain set of complaints. We can't assess whether someone was properly diagnosed or asked the right questions when they presented their situation to doctors or nurses at WellPath. There are other systems that do that. The state of California, for example, has an inspector general inside the prison system that does double check those decisions, and they have treatment professionals who work in that system who double check those kinds of decisions. And in some cases, not here, but in other parts of the country, there are jails or local facilities that'll hire a physician to double check that work. The county's contract with WellPath provides that we can audit their work. It doesn't describe much about how we would do that, who would do that. And I don't know that we ever do that, as far as I can tell as a county. So that's one part of oversight of the jail that we lack right now. And I don't know that we have a decision as a county about how to do that. So I think that's something that I think is going to have to play out down the pike. I see we have a couple questions. So it is probably a good time for me to switch over to those real quick. So one of the questions is, well, if folks are brought into the jail in their mental crisis, are they just put in with everybody else? Why is it that one might do that? Well, no, they're not. I mean, one of the things that there are a couple different ways that people with different levels of medical crisis can be treated. So say, for example, that somebody is committing a crime, but also having a mental health crisis out in the field, right? They're at a Safeway and they are breaking stuff open inside one of the aisles in Safeway, and they're yelling and screaming and throwing things at people. Well, that's vandalism. It might be theft. Those are crimes. So such a person could be arrested. But if it's clear they're having a mental health breakdown, they could also be just taken directly to a treatment facility. And in California, that usually means that they're held for a very short period of time, usually 24 hours, for assessment to see if they can just be stabilized and to see whether they really present a threat to themselves or others by mental health care professionals. And then once they're stabilized, they're either held for another 72 hours or they're released. And so that, what we call a 5150 hold, which is named after the law that allows that to happen, is one way people don't end up in the jail at all. But then after they're done with that brief time in mental health treatment, they're usually, most of the time, released back out into the public. Very few people are held for very long in that system in California. So another way that people can end up in custody is, say in that same example, maybe the crime's been a little bit more severe, and that person who's having a mental health crisis in the aisle at Safeway assaults one of the Safeway employees. Well, that's obviously a much more serious crime. The responding deputy might then arrest that person and take them to jail. And once they're in jail, there are actually different portions of the jail, different housing units, if you will, in jail. And this jail has the ability to house people in different sections depending on their needs. So if they have a mental health crisis and they've also been arrested on a significant crime, so they can be held in custody, there is a specialized unit in the jail where they can be held, and they receive much more treatment there. That's still, not exactly ideal, right? I mean, how many people would want to be in a hospital that looks and feels like a jail, right? It's not exactly a therapeutic environment. It's designed to hold people until their case gets litigated. So that's a real, I think, challenge here in Sonoma County. While it's good that there's a separate section inside the jail for that purpose, that's still probably not the ideal treatment situation for people who are incarcerated in jail. And in addition to that, I think the research seems to show that, generally speaking, people are going to be better off if they receive that treatment before they get to the point where they have to be incarcerated. And throughout California, we generally lack those treatment systems. So that's a really broad answer to that specific question. There was one other from Jim Duffy, which has to do with the question of competency. So Jim's question is, my understanding of the BHU was that it was primarily going to be used to bring incarcerated individuals to competency so they could stand trial. Is that wrong? Well, I think that is one of the purposes of the BHU. And what competency means in context is, I think, important to understand. So when someone is accused of committing a crime, one of the things that happens before they go to trial is they're assessed by the court to see whether they actually understand that they're going to be tried for a crime and that their liberty's on the line before they actually have the trial. So in other words, are they mentally competent? Are they intellectually competent to understand where they are, what's happening, and assist in their own defense? And if they're not, then we treat them until they are. That's an expensive and long-term process, and a behavioral health unit is one place where we would do that. But so someone could be held in a behavioral health unit until they're competent to stand trial, and that might take quite some time. It doesn't mean that the only people you would house there might be people who are waiting to see if they're competent to stand trial. The state has created a series of mental health courts, which, if implemented, would be one way to try to resolve mental health issues that are otherwise implicated in criminality. Say someone's competent currently to stand trial, but it was a mental health care crisis that caused them to commit their crime, and you can get them into mental health care treatment through the courts. A person like that can be held in a BHU. And there might be people who start to manifest a mental health problem while they're in jail, right? That you could also hold in the BHU. So it can have multiple purposes, but the ultimate goal is to try to make sure people who are having a mental health challenge while they're incarcerated can get some treatment. And there's a lot of shades of gray between those three types. Sometimes there's a lot of argument about which of those three categories a person fits into, which is one reason we have court proceedings about exactly whether someone's competent to stand trial. Jim, I know that's a lot of detail about a pretty straightforward question you asked. Do you have some other follow-up question to that? Feel free to raise your hand if you want. Or type something in. Okay, I'm not seeing anything from Jim, but Ricardo, I see you have your hand. I think you're muted though. I'm going to unmute you if I can. Oh, no, that's Jim. Jim, you have your hand up. And for some reason, I can't unmute you. Let me try that again. Lizette, maybe you're able to do that, but I can't seem to unmute Jim. I think maybe I lost host privilege.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Ah, there you are, Jim. Okay.
Okay. No, my understanding was from discussions with Mark Essick that that was going to be the primary function of the behavioral health unit. And once they, had filled it up with people that they were restoring to competency, that it would be full. It wouldn't have room for anybody else.
Interesting. Okay. I hadn't heard that before, but that's an interesting detail. I guess if we ever get the funding for it, we'll see how that works out. So another thing I want to talk about with respect to the jail is the staffing at the jail. And this is a place where I think the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office deserves a lot of credit. And particularly Eddie Ingram, who I think did some really good work personally as the elected sheriff on this issue. And so some of the things that we noticed there were that last fiscal year, the jail was clearly short-staffed. There were not enough correctional deputies to keep it functioning the way that it ought to. And this had been an ongoing problem since COVID, but was particularly acute last year. And one of the ways we saw that manifesting was that we did start getting some complaints from some people in the jail that they had not received as much time out of their cell as was required by state law. So state law has a set of regulations called Title 15 that mandates that people have to be out of their cells and able to do other things in the jail, like get exercise or go to a class or the like. The idea here is that that's important for their physical and mental health. And so some people were complaining that they weren't getting all of that time. And in a few cases, we did find a few people who did get shorted on the amount of time they're supposed to be out of the cell. And we found no evidence to believe that that was because anyone was deliberately or maliciously preventing them from getting out of their cell, but because it takes more staff time to have people out of their cells and in their cells. And the shortage of staffing was really impairing the jail's ability to provide this out of cell time. So the sheriff took several actions that we think were laudable last year to try to resolve that issue. First, and this isn't necessarily in any particular order, but first, he put together a contract with the approval of the Board of Supervisors with another county, Solano County, to house some prisoners there. So that necessarily brought the number of people in the jail down, which made the staff to prisoner ratio better, and that allowed for more out of cell time and other access to staff like programming and the like. So that was definitely an improvement. Since then, the jail staffing has improved and it hasn't been necessary to send people to Solano. So the last time that we heard from the sheriff's office just last week about this, they said that they have ended that program. It's no longer necessary to take people to Solano in order to resolve the staffing shortage. So that was a real positive. Another was that the jail obviously employs a lot of deputies to be the correctional staff of the jail. And in Sonoma County, we had historically had a rule that came from state law. It was just mirroring or copying state law, that to work in the jail as a correctional deputy, one had to also be either a citizen or on the track to becoming a citizen, like applying for citizenship here in the United States. So if someone had the legal right to work, but was not a citizen, which is a fair number of people in our society, you could not, as a matter of law, be a sheriff's deputy in the jail. And so state law changed in that regard just recently. And the sheriff took prompt action to go to our Civil Service Commission here in Sonoma County and change that job description so that it allowed people who were not citizens but had the legal right to work here in the U.S. to become sheriff's deputies in the jail, specifically as correctional deputies. And that expanded the employment pool. So the jail was able to put out a broader net and had a larger community of people from which to hire to bring into the jail, and also opened up that job to people who had a wider variety of language skills. Because as you might imagine, a lot of people who aren't citizens but have a legal right to work here have some kind of background either through family or from living abroad that made them fluent in some other language than English. And so a lot of those folks were able to bring their language skills to the jail too, which was a real positive. Not all counties have done that. Some have decided to stick with the rule that one has to be a citizen or on the path to citizenship in order to become a sheriff's deputy inside of a jail. And we took a more progressive, more open-minded position here in Sonoma County. I think the sheriff deserves some credit for that. Third, the sheriff also went out to the unions that represent sheriff's deputies here in Sonoma County and was able to convince, persuade some of the folks in those unions to allow deputies who had assignments other than the jail to come work at the jail for some shifts. Sonoma County takes the approach that there's really two different jobs for sheriff's deputies. One is in the jail and the other is out on patrol. And they call these two divisions the correction or detention division, and the other one is the law enforcement or patrol division. And there are two entirely separate jobs, separate job classifications in those two roles. So normally a person doesn't just switch back and forth from one to the other. Imagine it's sort of like if you were to use the analogy of a school, you might have some elementary school teachers who work for one elementary school district and some high school teachers who work for a totally separate high school district. They can't just switch back and forth any given day, right? It's a totally different job, a different assignment. Or if you look at a county level, say, attorneys that are working for the county counsel's office and attorneys that are working for the district attorney's office. They're both attorneys, they both work for the county, but they can't just be switched back and forth any given day. They're working in different environments, and their jobs only allow them to work in each of those two environments, only one or the other. And so because we have that system here in Sonoma County, pulling deputies off of patrol and having them work in the jail for a short period of time to help relieve the overstaffing isn't normally permitted in the Sonoma County system. So the sheriff went out of his way to try to negotiate an agreement with the unions to allow that for a period of time. And to his credit, he was successful, and that helped reduce the overcrowding as well. The fourth thing that happened, the credit that the sheriff deserves some credit for, was that he convinced the board of supervisors to create a hiring incentive, a bonus for signing on to work in the jail and then staying for a certain period of time, to try to make it more financially appealing to come work inside the Sonoma County Jail. A lot of other law enforcement agencies were doing that at the same time. So as a practical matter, we probably had to do that as a county to stay competitive in the marketplace. But still, that was a good move. And so between all four of those moves, the jail is now back to normal staffing. And I think that's a real positive. There is not enough staffing yet to reopen the old lower security detention facility out by the airport. And that would also be a positive, because that would probably allow for a greater degree of programming. That facility had more, say, classrooms and space for a wide variety of classes that we used to provide there. So it's unfortunate that that's not available yet. But at least with respect to the MADF, the main jail, big pink building right next to the courthouse, that one is now back at a normal staffing level. So I think those changes are something that I hope folks are noticing that the sheriff put a lot of time and effort into, and deserves some credit for having implemented. Are there questions about that staffing issue? No? Okay. So another topic that I want to talk about briefly is PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act. So PREA is a federal law that started in 2003, memory serves, and it was designed to force jails and prisons to take very seriously any allegation at all of sexual assault inside of a jail or prison, and described specific ways in which those cases had to be investigated, both as a potential crime against the person who is making the allegation, and as maybe a policy or employment violation by the people working in the jail, either because they were allegedly involved in that assault, or alternatively failed to prevent it as well as they should have. And so that body of law applies to the Sonoma County Jail, just like it does to every other jail or prison in the U.S. The origin of the concern there was primarily from federal prisons, where sexual assault was fairly common in at least some of the facilities, and this became well enough known that that caused Congress to create the Prison Rape Elimination Act. There are a variety of ways that jails and prisons try to prevent sexual assault inside of a jail or prison. And so there are a lot of tools other than the investigations I'm about to describe, but these investigations are really important. There should always be an administrative investigation of all of the personnel involved, But there should also be a criminal investigation into whatever the alleged sexual assault was. And what we had found 20 years ago was that in some facilities, they might do one or the other, but not both. Or just skip the criminal investigation and only do the administrative investigation, or just do neither one of them. And sometimes that was because the people who are making complaints weren't taken seriously. So PREA requires, first, that there always be a criminal investigation. So that allegation in the Sonoma County Jail goes to criminal investigators who then assess, well, what are the details about what the criminal assault that was described was, who allegedly did it, what evidence do we have if that person did or didn't do it. And that's supposed to be thoroughly documented. And that investigation is also supposed to include an assessment of the credibility of all of the people involved. So one of the things that, we are trying to make sure happens inside of a jail is that that criminal investigation takes the complainant seriously. And if they find out that complaint was not valid, explain in some detail why, right? Show that there's some evidence to believe it didn't occur, or show that this person was struggling from a mental health crisis at the time they made the allegation, etc. So those are the kinds of things that prisons in the federal system often did not do in the past. There wouldn't be any assessment of the credibility of the complainant. They would just say, well, they're clearly not credible, so we're not going to investigate. So what we found in Sonoma County is we did get some complaints from people who alleged that PREA wasn't followed in their cases, that they had made allegations of sexual assault that weren't followed up on. And what we consistently found in the cases that we looked at in Sonoma County Jail was that process of doing a criminal investigation and making sure that the credibility assessment was well thought out and in writing, and that all available evidence was gathered and assessed, was actually happening. So that's going actually very well. It's regrettable that there are people who have allegations to make and feel that they might have a sexual assault to complain about. But on the other hand, we do know that the jail is doing a thorough job of investigating this. So that's a positive. Second, there's supposed to be an administrative investigation that the jail undertakes to dig deeper into whether there are any administrative or policy violations. So were cell checks happening on a regular basis, meaning were deputies coming by and checking that person's welfare as frequently as they should have? Were cameras working? When the alleged sexual assault was reported, was it documented promptly by the people who were involved in documenting it? Things like that. A little separate from the actual assault itself, but making sure all the preventative mechanisms were in place and followed to keep it from happening, and that all the follow-up once it was alleged to have happened occurred also. Making sure that people are given access to mental health, to physical health care after they allege the assault, right? Is another example. So those steps all seem to be being followed in Sonoma County, and the administrative investigation to double check that all that work is being done around the allegation of sexual assault, both to prevent it and to respond to it, also seems to be happening correctly and thoroughly. So that's not the case everywhere. And the fact that we took a look at these issues around PREA and found a very high level of compliance is a real positive. And I think that's an issue that the jail deserves some credit for. Questions about PREA? No? Okay. Another thing that I think is worth talking about at the jail is the preservation of video there. There are two main ways that video evidence is collected at the jail. One are body-worn cameras, like you might see out in the field that police officers would wear or use. And then the other is stationary video that's mounted in different places throughout the jail. So between the two, theoretically, one could get video of almost any place inside the jail because one or the other of those two cameras might work. Realistically, the hard installed or mounted cameras up on a wall are very expensive to install and maintain. In body-worn camera, while it's much more flexible and can be used to look almost anywhere in a jail, isn't on all the time. And there are good reasons for that. One reason is there are some things that happen in the jail about which we should provide some people some privacy. And also, we generally have a policy about body-worn camera that's it's only activated when something comes to the attention of the detention deputy that really merits recording, like a negative interaction with somebody who's incarcerated in the jail, an emergency, a potential crime that's happening, an assault that they see in front of them, their response to someone in medical emergencies, such that they think there might be an in-custody death, happening in front of them. Those are all reasons why a camera might get activated, and they're just not activated all the time for every purpose. And remarkably, it is actually expensive and time-consuming to keep all that footage. So most agencies don't have a body-worn camera on all the time, and we don't recommend that either at all. That said, we did find some instances in which we thought sheriff's deputies should have activated their body-worn camera because they saw one of the kinds of situations we just described, particularly situations where people who were incarcerated in the jail started becoming upset and agitated because they felt they were being treated in a way that was disrespectful. Documenting those interactions is really important because they frequently do result in complaints, and investigating those complaints can be done with a much higher degree of accuracy if the situation is recorded by camera. So we did recommend to the jail that they spend some more time training some of the deputies that are using body-worn camera in the jail to be more assertive about activating it when they're in that kind of a situation. The second issue that we saw was that there was at least one pretty well publicized civil case in which the county had some trouble in court because they had lost, actually at some point probably destroyed, some of the video from some of those wall-mounted cameras I described. With a system like that, the video is not preserved forever, nor is it feasible to save it forever. Those systems only have so much storage space, and it does require time, effort, money to preserve the video from those systems. So here in Sonoma County, we have a system that you see in most counties, which is one where that material is copied or retained in an archive if it's flagged as being particularly important, like related to an ongoing civil case or criminal case that stemmed from something that happened in the jail. If that process is not used to save the jail footage, then eventually it's just periodically deleted. And we found that with the stationary video, there was at least one really prominent incident where that was deleted and should not have been. So we made some recommendations about improving that system too. And to their credit, the jail seems to have taken on, those particular reforms we've suggested. I see we have a hand up from Alcina Horseman. And Alcina, if you want, go ahead.
This might be kind of a dumb question since I've been to so many meetings, but when you make recommendations, how do we know whether or not they're taking your recommendations? Like, we know because of the K-9 policy that they've actually changed policy. So you can see those actual changed policies, but how do you know if they're even considering your recommendations? Is this just like, what is the process of that? Anyway, yeah.
Okay, well, I would say a couple things. I mean, one is we do try to talk about that in our annual report. And so if we did get some response back, we include that in the annual report. We don't always get a response back, right? So you'll notice if you go through each of the individual cases we've laid out in the annual report, that for most of them, we've noted that there wasn't a response from the sheriff's office, but in a few we did. In addition to that, we provide our annual report to the sheriff's office and ask them if they have any feedback before we finalize it. And we do that for a couple reasons. One is to see if they think we got anything wrong that we should change. And if they did, we tell the public exactly how that conversation went down, what they suggested we got wrong, and how we changed the report. We didn't make any changes to the report this year. In fact, we got that feedback from the sheriff's office later than we asked, so we weren't able to include it in the annual report directly. but we did get a written response back that we're going to put on our website that doesn't flag anything as being incorrect in our report, but also details some of the things that the sheriff's office did. So when the sheriff's office does take up some of our policy recommendations, we describe that in the annual report, and they describe it in their response to our annual report. So that's two ways you can see what change they made. Other than that, there is not, say, a central database anywhere that records those. There was a period of time where IOLERO was not getting any responses from the sheriff's office about any of IOLERO's recommendations. Fortunately, we're in an era where we do get some responses back periodically, and at some point in the future, when we catch up a little bit more on some of our audits, maybe it would make sense to have a place on our website that would detail some of those. If you look at the city of Pasadena, for example, they recently created an accessible database where you can see the recommendations made by their police oversight system and what the responses were from the police department. We don't have that yet here in Sonoma County, but we're starting to get to a point where we might have enough that could be a useful thing for us to do in the future. So maybe you'll see that from us in the upcoming fiscal year. Any other questions about that issue? No? Okay. Those are some of the things that I thought were most important about our annual report. And I'm wondering if there's anybody here at the town hall that has a question, not about me, but about something in the report that they're curious to learn more about. It looks like Alcina, your hand's up.
Sorry, it's me again. I've just started the report. I haven't had time to read the whole report. I think you might have said this at the last meeting. As we read it, because I'm going to try to read it, I'm trying to find time to get to it, bringing this to the meetings.
Mm-hmm. Oh, copies? Yeah, hard copies, you mean? You mean you're suggesting we bring hard copies of the report to CAC meetings?
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Maybe
no, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that I'm trying to read this report and I'm probably going to have more questions. Do we just bring those questions to the CAC? This is your big town hall where you're digging in and we can ask questions freely without all of the obstructions of the CAC meeting. However, it's been a short time for some of us to be able to read it.
Yeah. Well, sure. Yeah, you can bring those questions to us anytime. You can bring them to CAC meetings and pitch them during the director's report. I know the CAC is digesting this too, and they might have some other questions down the pike that'll come up at CAC meetings, and that's perfectly fine.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I did want to respond to Jim's question. I like that you like the town hall. And I would give a shout out to the Press Democrat because I did see a note in there today flagging this event tonight and explaining how to get onto it. So I am appreciating them for having created a little publicity about tonight's town hall. For those of you who came, thanks for coming. I don't have anything else. Oh, wait, I have another hand up, and I think that's Barbara Grasecci.
Yes, it is. Just some comments. I think I started reading the report, but most people don't have time to read a couple 100-page report. And so I feel like this town hall was really great, but somehow because I know you guys have budget now, to really intentionally figure out how to do that outreach so that the word gets out. And I don't have a specific recommendation other than I don't think what's currently happening is super effective in just getting the word out broadly. Like the PD, being in the PD like the day before, also how many people actually read the paper anymore. So it's a complicated thing, but I think maybe there's some way that you guys can put a little advisory committee together outside of the CAC could ask some community members to come up with some better suggestions, because most people are not going to read the report. That's just and it's a fantastic report, and that's terrible because this is what the voters were begging for, this level of information. So I don't know the answer, but I do think there are communications professionals out there somewhere that we should be able to pull data from to kind of get some ideas around how to really make this more accessible to the community, because it is so important. And then the only other thing I would say is, now that you're fully staffed and you're doing so many audits, like maybe there needs to be a quarterly IOLERO report, so it's more digestible rather than like, I've thought about this. The downside is you don't maybe get the bigger trend line if you're doing like more regular reporting, and I don't know what the legal rules are about doing that anyway, but
Yeah.
it just seems like it's only going to get bigger, right? Because you guys are now staffed, and all of your staff is like now been on the job, so it's just going to be a huge report, which is great. But
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's been a lot of hunger for this level of transparency, but then on the other hand, it's like a fire hose, right? It's a lot of material. And I don't know that there's any one unifying theme in this year's report. In some years there's like one or two things that we really want to highlight and focus on. But I also noticed that there tends to be a lot more public attention to the kinds of cases where our audits can be entirely public. There's a very small number of those. There's only one this year, which is described in our report, and has to do with a deputy making some sexual advances on someone who was a victim of a crime over text. And it's unusual that we're able to make cases like that public. And so I'm glad that we're able to do that. But I also find that that tends to be where the public really engages with the work that IOLERO does, because those individual cases, because we can make them public and describe them in detail, it just seems to grab the public attention more. And it also is the case that those are usually cases in which there's a high consequence event, like an in custody death or a deputy involved shooting, that the public really is interested in learning more about and maybe has passionate feelings about. And as we release those individually, we find there's a lot of public interest in those particular cases. I anticipate over this next year, we're going to have a series of cases like those that we'll be able to make public. And that'll be something that the public will probably get engaged about in between annual reports. There's also an ad hoc or a subcommittee at the Community Advisory Council that's talking about this issue. How can we better engage the public, and what are the different ways we can do that? And I'm really looking forward to seeing what they come up with. So hopefully they'll find some of those experts that you mentioned, Barbara.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Well, thank you for engaging with us in this town hall. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you again next year for sure. And then, of course, we have another CAC meeting coming up on January 8th, where we'll see you as well. Thanks, everybody.